"You drove 30 miles to show me a bolt." The service manager was laughing when he said it. He was holding the bolt by the tips of 2 fingers, and he had lifted it up into the air so that everyone in line could see it, and the 6 men waiting at the counter laughed too. But there was one man in that room who knew what that bolt was. And he said nothing. On every machine that works the ground, there is one part that is put there to break, and its job is to snap when the machine is overloaded and save the $9,000 gear set behind it. It works like a fuse. Its whole job is to blow. The bolt lying on the counter that morning was that part, and it was perfectly whole. And yet, in the back of that same building, on the other side of the wall where that laugh was ringing out, the tractor that bolt was supposed to protect stood split clean down the middle, each side propped up on stands. The man who had laid the bolt on the counter stayed silent. His name was Verle Ames. He was 66 years old, and the ruined tractor was his. The repair bill came to $9,400, and Verle did not have that kind of money. The man who had lifted the bolt into the air was named Verle Kessler. Monday morning, October 21st, 1974, Champaign County, Illinois. The parts department at Vanderslice Implement in Rantoul smelled of new rubber and grease, and Kessel had run that dealership's shop for 22 years. There was not a man in the county who could find what was wrong with the tractor faster than he could. But 9 days later, standing in the middle of his own shop, Verle Kessler would fail to answer a question for the first time in his life. Verle Ames had been buying his machinery from that store for 31 years. His father had done the same, and until that morning, he had never once raised his voice inside it. So why hadn't that bolt broken? And out of every man in that room, why was he the only one who knew? To find the answer, you have to go back to the fall of 1932, to the same county, and to a corn picker. That fall, Verle was 24 years old, and he was running his father Sherman Ames's new idea corn picker. It was the bottom year of the Depression. Corn was going for 30 cents a bushel, and there was no such thing as cash on that farm. That morning, the machine's shear bolt broke 3 times. But the young Verle did not see that as protection. He saw it as a breakdown. After the 3rd break, he left the machine standing in the field, walked to the hardware store in Sydney, and asked the man for a better bolt. The man gave him a dark, heavy, hardened bolt. Verle put that bolt in. That afternoon, the stump of an old fence post still buried in the ground went into the snapping rolls. The bolt did not break. The gearbox on the machine broke instead. The repair came to $40. And in 1932, $40 was 2 months' wages for a hired man. Sherman Ames did not raise his voice at his son. That evening, he took him out to the tool shed, laid the 2 bolts side by side on the bench, and brought the kerosene lamp in close. Then he said, "The cheap part is there to die, Verle. Make it stronger and the expensive one dies in its place." He took the $40 out of his son's share, and he never brought the matter up again. Years later, they began putting lines on the heads of bolts, and those lines told everybody the same thing. No lines meant soft. 3 lines meant hardened. 6 lines meant hard as stone. But Verle Ames had already learned what those lines meant before the lines were ever invented, from a gearbox and $40. From that day on, every bolt that came into his hand, he took by the head first and turned it to the light. And, for 41 years, that habit never earned him a single cent. The day it finally would began with a lowboy trailer pulling into the yard of the 320 acres his father had bought in 1919, August 9th, 1973. A Thursday. There were 2 machines on that lowboy, a John Deere 4430, sound guard cab, quad-range transmission, dual wheels, wheel weights, and behind it, on the same invoice, a brand new John Deere 1600 chisel plow. Together, they came to $21,790. A 5-year note, first payment due January 2nd. The chisel plough had come from the factory knocked down in a wooden crate. The shanks and the shear bolt at the pivot of every shank had been installed by the dealer's own shop. The delivery man handed Virgil a 3-copy form, a pre-delivery inspection form. 34 lines, a check mark beside every line, and at the bottom, beneath the words that said, "Inspected by," a signature. Dwight Kessler. Virgil read that form from top to bottom. Line 19 out of 34 read, "Chisel plough, shanks and shear bolts installed to specification." There was a check mark beside it. Virgil folded the carbon copy in half and put it in the drawer in his kitchen. He figured that piece of paper would never be good for anything. For 14 months, he was right. 1974 was a bad year. April came in cold and wet, the corn went in late, and then the summer dried up and quit. An early frost came in September and killed the unripe corn where it stood. By the middle of October, Virgil Ames still had 190 acres of corn standing in the field. It was light, it was wet, and at the elevator every point of moisture would cut another slice out of him. The dry summer had turned that black prairie soil into concrete. On Friday, October 11th, Virgil was pulling the chisel plough 10 inches deep across the 80 acres he had already picked. The forecast called for rain, and that ground had to be worked before winter froze it. The third shank from the left hit something under the dirt. It was not a sound. It was a blow. The tractor lurched once, the engine choked for a second, and from under the right rear wheel came a short, dry crack. Virgil pushed in the clutch, put it in neutral, and climbed down. Black oil was running out of the hub, and in that oil there were tiny flecks of metal glittering in the evening sun. Duals, wheel weights, ground like concrete. The tires had not spun. Nothing had slipped. There was nowhere else for it to stop, so it stopped in the most expensive place there was. To drag the plough home, he had to take that shank off. Virgil went down on his knees, backed the nut off, and pushed on the bolt, but it would not come out. He tried again. It did not budge. It had bent inside the hole. The impact had curved it like a bow and locked it into the pivot. He walked to the truck, came back with a punch and a hammer, and drove that bolt out of its hole. Then he took it in his palm, held it by the head, and turned it to the setting sun. There were 3 thin radial lines on the head of that bolt. Virgil Ames dropped it in his coat pocket and turned back to the tractor, because there was only one thing on his mind that evening, and it was not a bolt. 190 acres of corn were still standing in the field. There was a payment of $5,180 due on January 2nd, and the machine that was supposed to bring that corn in was lying dead in the field behind him. That bolt stayed in his coat pocket for exactly 7 days. He would not take it out again until a night when he was certain he had lost everything under the lamp on his kitchen table. And only then would he remember what his father had taught him all those years ago. On Monday, October 14th, the Vanderslice lowboy came and took the 4430 away. On the morning of Friday, October 18th, Virgil Ames drove the 30 miles north, and when he walked into the service department, he saw his tractor for the first time the way it was now. Opened up, the oil pan pulled off, its insides lying outside. Dwight Kessler came over with a folder in his hand, and before he said anything, he looked Virgil in the face. "Your right final drive is in pieces," he said. "The metal went through the shared oil all the way into the transmission. The repair bill comes to $9,400, and it is not covered under warranty." Virgil did not speak for a while. Then he said, "Why not?" He had not asked it like a question. Kessler shrugged. "Because you pulled that chisel plough 10 inches deep through ground like stone in 3rd gear," he said. "Duals, wheel weights, and a man in a hurry on top of it. This one is on you, Virgil. I have been doing this work for 22 years, and I have seen this final drive go 4 times in this county. All 4 for the same reason." Then he added, "A man your age shouldn't be running a machine this big anymore." Virgil drove the 30 miles back that day. The bank in Sydney said no because 1974 was a bad year, and that October nobody in the county was getting new money. He had $1,847 in his account. He had a note payment of $5,180 due on January 2nd, and he had 190 acres of corn still standing in the field. That night, at the kitchen table, he emptied out his coat pocket. A pencil, a screw, 2 kernels of corn, and a 31-cent bolt spilled out onto the oilcloth. The bolt spun once and stopped. Virgil picked it up, wiped the oil off it with his thumb, and turned it under the lamp. 3 lines. And 42 years on, he saw once again 2 bolts lying side by side on a bench in a tool shed. He sat there a long time without moving. Then he got up, opened the drawer, took the carbon copy of the form out from under the scissors and the twine, and found line 19, chisel plough, shanks and shear bolts installed to specification. There was a check mark beside it. There was a signature at the bottom, and that signature belonged to Dwight Kessler. Verle Ames did not sleep that night because one question kept turning over in his head. Who put that bolt in there? He waited 2 days. He was not a man who did things in a hurry. On the morning of Monday, October 21st, he drove the 30 miles north again, and he did not go to the service department. He went to the parts counter. He gave the young man behind the counter the model of the plough and asked for the part number of the shear bolt that went in the shank pivot. The young man opened the thick grey catalogue, found the page, ran his finger along the line and wrote the number down on a slip of paper. Then, because a customer had asked, he read it out loud. 5/8 of an inch across, 3½ inches long, grade 2, no markings. The 6 men in line heard him, and right at that moment, the service door opened. Kessler came out, the 6 men laughed, and the bolt dropped back down onto the counter. Kessler pushed the rag into his pocket and went back into the shop, and the men went back to their coffee. The young man at the counter had gone red to his ears. He pushed the slip of paper across to Virgil and asked him if he wanted one. Virgil did. The young man took a soft, grey, unmarked bolt out of a drawer in the back and put it in a small paper bag, 31 cents. Virgil laid the money on the counter, put the bag in his pocket, and drove the 30 miles home. That morning, Vanderslice Implement sold Verle Ames the thing that would finish them for 31 cents. That night, Virgil wrote 1 page. He did not use a single adjective. He did not complain. He did not ask for money, and he did not accuse anybody. He wrote the serial number of the tractor and the serial number of the plough, the date on the delivery form, and line 19. He wrote the part number and what the catalogue said about that number, unmarked, grade 2. Then he wrote down how many lines were on the head of the bolt in his own hand. And at the bottom of the page he wrote 1 question. Who put that bolt in there? He folded the carbon copy of the form, put it in the envelope, addressed it to the factory branch house in Moline, and on the morning of Tuesday, October 22nd, he dropped it at the post office in Sydney. Then nothing happened for 8 days, and the corn stood in the field and waited. On the morning of Wednesday, October 30th, a grey company car came up the lane. The man who got out was named Gordon Reich. He had come from Moline. He was the factory's district service representative, and he had Virgil's letter in his hand. He stayed on his feet. He asked for the bolt, took a small magnifying glass out of his coat, and studied the head of it for a long time. Then he looked up and asked 1 question. Where is your plough? They walked out to the shed. Reich took a wrench out of his trunk, crouched down, and pulled the bolt from the 4th shank from the left. He held it to the light. 3 lines. Then he moved to the 7th shank. 3 lines. He moved to the 10th, and he stopped before he even loosened the nut because he no longer needed to look. He stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and said, "Get in your truck. We're going to Rantoul." They walked into the service department at 2 in the afternoon. The 4430 was still up on the stands. Kessler was at a bench, and he recognized Reich. A man from the factory turning up unannounced was not a good thing, and you could read that on his face. Reich did not hurry any part of it. First, he laid the bolt on the bench. Then he laid the other 2 bolts he had taken off the plough down beside it. Then he opened the thick grey catalogue and left the page open. Then he unfolded the carbon copy, smoothed it flat with the edge of his hand, and put his finger on line 19. 4 things, side by side, on a workbench. Everyone in the shop had stopped. Standing in the parts doorway was one of the men who had laughed at that counter 9 days earlier, and he was not moving either. Then Reich took his magnifying glass out again and studied the head of each of the 3 bolts one at a time in front of everybody. "How many lines are on the heads of these bolts?" he asked. Nobody answered. Then Virgil Ames spoke in a voice that was low but perfectly clear. 3, he said. "All 3 of them. 3. The service department went quiet. Reich kept his finger on line 19 and raised his eyes to Kessel. "Dwight," he said, "the day you signed this line, did you look at those bolts?" Kessel opened his mouth and nothing came out, because there was nothing that could come out. If he had looked, then he had seen 3 lines and signed it anyway. If he had not looked, then he had certified something he never saw. Both doors opened into the same room. Kessel finally spoke, and what came out was not a defense. It was a reflex. "What does a bolt have to do with a final drive?" he said. And that was when Virgil Ames, in the store he had been buying from for 31 years, raised his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear it for the first time in his life. "You told me I pulled too hard," he said. "A man cannot pull hard enough to break that gear, Dwight. The tires would spin long before that. For that gear to break, something has to stop the tractor dead." And something did. He put his hand down on the bench. This bolt did not break, because it could not break. It was put there to break. But somebody put a bolt in its place that was hard as stone, and that bolt refused to break, so the $9,400 thing broke instead. The cheap part is there to die. Make it stronger, and the expensive one dies in its place. Kessel tried one last time. "You can't prove that came from an impact," he said. "It could have been fatigue." Gordon Reich did not answer him. He walked over to the stand, picked up the largest piece of the shattered planetary gear, and held it under the lamp. "A fatigue break comes in rings," he said. "Like the years in a cut tree. The crack walks for months, and it leaves its marks behind. There are no rings in this break. It is bright, it is grainy, and it happened all at once. This gear did not die over months, Dwight. It died in 1 second." Then he looked at his watch and turned to the shop. "Before dark, load a demonstrator 4430 on a trailer and get it out to Mr. Ames's yard. This man has 190 acres of corn standing in the field." And you might have thought that was the end of it. But Gordon Reich was not finished. He left the bench, walked into the parts department, and asked for the stock card on that part number. The card came out of a drawer, a yellow piece of cardstock, filled in by hand, ruled in ink, with the date of every receipt and every issue on it. Reich looked at the date of the last receipt. June 1973. 16 months. After that date, that dealership had not taken in a single one of those bolts. And for those 16 months, that shop had never stopped working. Reich asked for the delivery records and counted. Since June of 1973, that shop had assembled and delivered 63 tillage implements, 5 counties, 63 machines, every one of them out in the fields, every one of them carrying bolts in its shanks that would refuse to break. The factory paid the bill. The tractor was finished in the middle of November, and the $9,400 was charged back to Vanderslice Implement. Virgil Ames got his corn in. Late, wet, docked 11 cents a bushel, but he got it in. And at the end of November, on a Saturday morning, an old pickup came up the lane, and a 20-year-old boy got out of it. His name was Neil Boyer. In the summer of 1973, he had been an apprentice in Vanderslice's shop, and so many implements had been put together that summer that one day the factory's unmarked bolts ran out. The boy took the stronger one out of the bin beside it, because he was 19 years old, and he thought the stronger one was the better one. He stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets. "I put those bolts in," he said. Virgil Ames walked out to the shed, and the boy followed him. Inside, he laid the two bolts side by side on the bench and brought the lamp in close. Then he said, "Look, the cheap part is there to die. Make it stronger, and the expensive one dies in its place." 42 years earlier, there had been another shed, another lamp, and another boy. And that boy was 66 years old now, and he was saying the same words. He did not make Neil Boyer pay a cent. He simply put the bolt in the boy's hand and sent him home. The factory's audit took 6 weeks. The letters went out that winter. 63 envelopes, 5 counties, every one of them with a free bolt kit inside and instructions to check every shank. One of those envelopes landed in January in the mailbox of one of the men who had laughed at that counter on that Monday morning. He opened it in his kitchen, read it, then picked up a wrench and walked out to his shed. That spring, the dealership agreement was terminated. In June of 1975, the sign came down, and the Vanderslice name came off the post it had stood on for 40 years. Nobody fired Dwight Kessel. The dealership simply closed, and he went back to being a mechanic in another shop, under another man. And for years afterward, the men in Rantoul who took their tractors to him all told the same story. Whatever the job was, every bolt that came into Kessel's hand, he took by the head first and turned it to the light. He never said anything while he did it. He never explained it to anybody. But he never signed his name to another thing without looking. Virgil Ames never threw that 3-line bolt away. He kept it in a tobacco tin on his workbench, and every young man who ever came to work on his place had that tin opened for him once. Only once. His tractor ran until 1989. Maybe you have had a day like that yourself. A room full of people, every one of them telling you that you are wrong, and something in the palm of your hand that nobody else in that room could read. If stories like this one mean something to you, stories about quiet men, and about the places nobody bothers to look, you can subscribe to the channel. And tell me this, if that bolt had been in your hand, would you have driven the 30 miles? Or would you have paid the bill?